Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to NParks 7 Human Wildlife Encounters webinar. Thank you all for joining us on Zoom as well as on YouTube. My name is Serena and I will be your host for this morning. So our efforts to enhance natural spaces have brought us closer to nature and wildlife. This is the 7th sessions of a series of webinars where we had covered different wildlife commonly encountered within our urban spaces, as well as the science-based approach in understanding their ecology and distribution as we promote responsible and positive human-wildlife coexistence. Well, today's webinar is on the theme of urban birds in our city in nature. We'll be joined by our colleagues from the NParks Wildlife Management team, Dr. Malcolm Soh, Ms. Huizhen Han, and Ms. Magena together with Dr. Shang Zhexie from the Jurong Bird Park. So all our speakers are actively involved in the conservation and management of urban birds in Singapore. So today, they will together share more about the research studies involving these native birds, as well as pest birds, the rescue and monitoring of raptors, and we'll also answer all your queries on what to do when we encounter these birds in our city in nature. Well, after the sharing, we will be having an interactive Q&A session. If you have any questions along the way, do send them to Nicholas as a private chat on Zoom, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. Now, Singapore is known for our rich bird biodiversity, having more than 400 recorded species. I hope you are as excited as I am to hear about some of these birds from our speakers as I am. I'll now hand the time over to Malcolm, who is our senior researcher from the Wildlife Management Research Team. Malcolm, please.
Okay, thank you, Serena. Right, so I'll introduce some of the studies that we have done to better understand bird ecology. So the first one would be the Garden Bird Watch Survey. And then the second one, my colleague Huizhen will talk about the Boo Ecology Project. So the birds in which you see at the bottom down here, all birds in which you can see in our urban spaces. It's just that some of them, perhaps you can hear them more often than you see them. But I think if you try hard enough, you can see some of these birds like the blue-crowned hanging parrot, common arrow, the hornbill, as well as the coppersmith barbet. Right. Okay, so let's talk about the Garden Bird Watch first. What is it? It's a citizen science program. It's led by NParks to involve the community in conducting bird surveys. But of course, the data that's collected will also help us to better understand the ecology of birds in Singapore. Right, so we have about 348 point counts that were conducted across 64 sites. So point counts are basically a kind of a survey method in which we stand at a particular spot and we count birds for a certain period of time, right? And down here, presenting just 5 years of data from 2015 and 2019. We have about more than 1,000 volunteers that took part in this Garden Bird Watch. And we also have some training. So we taught about 34 different bird species. The common ones are taught to volunteers that have done this they're doing this for the first time. But all in all, quite impressively, there are 184 bird species that were counted. Right, so the first question in which we wanted to ask was, are the bird communities similar across these 64 different sample green spaces? So in this plot down here, you'd see this 64 different sites, and then you have the parks that are clustered a little bit more on the left-hand side of this plot. And then the rest of the other green spaces are clustered a little bit more on the right. So what the analysis is trying to do is to try and try to group cluster sites that are a bit more similar in terms of the species composition together, right? So down here, what you see is that in the park areas, right, they would have bird species that are more similar, and the reserves would have bird species that are more similar to each other. Down here, you don't see a very distinct difference. You don't see distinct clusters. It's more a gradual change, right? So it's corresponding to this gradient of disturbance that we see along this first axis, right? So this means to say that the bird species composition is gradually changing as you move from left to right. So like in your park areas, you may get certain species like your yellow-vented bulbuls or your Javan mynas that are a bit more adapted to urban areas. Whereas in the reserves, you get some species like your red-crowned barbets or your cream-vented bulbuls, which are forest specialists, and you won't find so much in your parks. Okay, next one. Okay, so the next question, which we wanted to know what are the factors that affect species richness. So here we ran a few models, and our models predict there's a higher species richness in parks which have less irregular shapes. So if you look at the picture on the right, this shows you different forest patches of different shapes, isn't it? So you have higher species richness, meaning to say you have more species in areas that are where you have less edge exposure. So the diagram on the bottom, right? Yes, so apart from that, we also find you have more higher species richness in areas in which you have more vegetation, and also areas in which you have a greater area of surrounding water. So the pictures on the bottom down there, those birds are associated with freshwater environments more. So your white-breasted waterhen, your collared kingfisher, your gray heron, as well as your craigs, right? These are birds in which are associated more with freshwater environments. But if you have mud flats or if you have like sandy shores, then you get your shorebirds coming in as well, like your plovers and your sandpipers. Right, so in conclusion, we found that the shape of the forest patch as well as water bodies were key environmental factors in increasing the species richness in a particular area. Green spaces that are more regular in shape had higher species richness, and also green spaces with more water also had more species. Right, so I'll pass the time now to my colleague, Zhen, who will talk more about bulbuls.
Hello. Hi, so besides the garden bird watch, another ecological studies that we're currently doing is on the straw-headed bulbuls and other resident bulbuls. So before I talk about the project, I just give you a brief introduction to bulbuls. So bulbuls is our medium-sized songbirds in a family Pycnonothidae, so which consists of a total of 152 species. Now, bulbuls are distributed all across Africa, the Middle East, and Southern Asia, but they can also be found as far up north in Japan. So in Singapore, we can see 13 species of native and non-native bulbuls. In terms of their physical appearance, bulbuls vary in length from 13 centimeters to 29 centimeters. And as you can see in the image on the left, most of them are usually in dull colors like brown, olive, gray, but some of them have patches of bright colors like red, white, orange, and then both sexes look alike, so that we can't tell the males and females apart. Yeah, thanks. So bulbuls eat a wide range of food. They eat fruits, insects, seeds, nectar, and small vertebrates like lizards. But their main diet consists of fruits and small insects. So you can see the picture on the left, there's a yellow-vented bulbul feeding berries to its chicks, and then there's a red-whiskered bulbul with a small stick insect in its beak. Now, bulbuls can be found in habitats ranging from forests to urban greenery, like your neighborhood parks. And their calls are quite variable, so they can range from harsh chattering calls that consist of repetitive notes to like melodious whistling songs. So one species that has a melodious song is the straw-headed bulbul. Their calls are very loud and very flute-like with a nice melody. So because of their song, they are highly sought after to be kept in captivity, and large numbers are trapped from the wild in other countries. So as a result, they are currently listed as critically endangered. Yeah, and Singapore is one of their last strongholds. So that is why we're doing this project. So because they're native to Singapore and they're critically endangered, but we don't know much about their ecology. So what we want to do is study the interactions of straw-headed bulbul with the environment and also their interactions with other congeners, which are 7 other bulbul species that we're focusing for this project. So the data collected will then be used to provide evidence-based conservation plans. So how we do that is to study the changes in landscape, the vegetation structure, the microclimate, and the occurrences of bulbuls. So we see how these changes will affect the distribution of the straw-headed bulbul in Singapore. Yeah. So to measure the abundance and occurrence of bulbuls, we are doing point count surveys, and this is done in collaboration with volunteers from the Nature Society of Singapore. Then surveys are conducted in the morning from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. in good weather conditions. And surveyors will record the abundance of 8 bulbul species, either by sight or sound. So for this project, we're focusing on the straw-headed, the yellow-vented, cream-vented, the olive-winged, the Asian red-eyed, the black-crested, the sooty-headed, and the red-whiskered bulbul. Yeah. So on top of point count surveys, we're also doing autonomous sound recording. So sound recorders are placed in the same localities as the point counts, and they're scheduled to record 10 minutes at the start of every hour, from morning 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. and in the evening 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. So you can see the picture on the left. The green color device is the sound recorder itself. It's a pretty small device, like 3/4 the size of your bank card. And then on the right is how the recorders are deployed on field. So we place the recorders in this brown waterproof casing. Yeah. So to study the environment that the bulbuls occur in, we carried out vegetation surveys. On the local level, we measured things like canopy cover, tree volume, and we counted the number of fruiting and flowering trees. And on a landscape level, we will measure land use cover. So we do that by calculating the area of forest fragments. Yeah, besides vegetation surveys, we also record the ambient temperature every hour, every day. And this is done by using temperature loggers called the eye buttons, which is what you see the image on the left there. So because bulbuls are mostly found in forests or they are like found amongst the trees, they are often detected more by their call than by sight. So the surveyors will need to be able to identify each species by their sounds. But thankfully, each species has their own unique calls and sounds. So, for example, the 4 bulbuls that you see below are the more commonly seen and heard in our parks and nature reserves. So let's have a listen at what their calls sound like. So the first one is the olive-winged bulbul. As you can hear, it's a very melodious sound consisting of a few notes that they repeat it quite often. And then now let's listen to the yellow-vented bulbul call. So as you can hear, it's a relatively longer song and it's more of a constant tempo. Yeah. Now we listen to the straw-headed bulbul. So if you go to a nature reserve like Dairy Farm Nature Park, you'll definitely not miss these guys because their songs are very loud and very flute-like, very melodious as well. Okay. Then the last one, we'll have a listen at the red-whiskered bulbul. Yeah, so you can hear that the song is actually quite short. It's consisting of like 5 to 6 notes that is like repeating a few times as well. So yeah, so the surveys are still ongoing at the moment, so we don't have the results yet. So the data will be analyzed at a later stage. I will now pass the time back to Malcolm, who will talk more about the ecological studies that we are carrying out on pest birds as invasive species management. Yeah. Thank you.
minute. Okay, right. So now we're going on to pest beds. So I'll talk about some of the major pest beds in which you can see in Singapore, their impacts on our environment, some of the ecological studies in which we're doing, and last, we'll talk about the management implications. Right, thanks. So for major pest beds in Singapore, these are the three main amigos lah. All right, you see your house crow, your Javan myna, as well as your rock pigeon. Okay, so I'm sure everyone has seen this. So in terms of the impact on our environment, they mainly cause these amenities, right? So it's like soiling. So you can see in the picture on the right, that's a lot of pigeon poop, right? Because the fecal matter is corrosive, they also cause damage to property. Sometimes you also get occasional attacks on people. So that's mainly for house crows, right? So especially if you're walking under the nests and the house crows are breeding, sometimes they're a little bit territorial and they might swoop down on you just to try and chase you off, right? Some of them also are vectors for diseases, right? And the last impact is an ecological one. Sometimes they could also compete with your native species. So the example I'm thinking of down here is between the house crow as well as with the large bill crow. So you might have seen this before. The large bill crow is not as common as our native crow, as the house crow. The way you tell them apart is by, well, you can use the beak, but down here in this photo it's not very obvious. For the large bill crow, it's slightly thicker. But the more obvious difference is the nape, right? So at the back of the neck, see the feathers down there tend to be a bit more grayish. And in terms of the calls, they are also different. So large bill crow has a bit more of a piratey kind of call. It goes a bit like ah, 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 right? Whereas the house crow is a bit more of a squawk. Right, so what are some of the studies in which NParks conducted on pest birds too? So one is looking at the effects of food reduction on pest bird abundance, as well as the activities. I'll just talk about abundance this time around. And for what else we did was also to study the pest bird ecology in hawker centers also. Okay, so let's talk about first the effects of limiting food on pest bird abundance, right? So we all know that abundance in food that's provided by people can increase pest bird populations, but the scientific evidence that shows the effectiveness of this food limitation in controlling pest birds is lacking, right? So the COVID-19 pandemic actually offered a very unique research opportunity to determine the effectiveness of food reduction on affecting local abundance as well as their behavior. So here we ask the question, how has the abundance of feral pigeons changed over the circuit breaker phases? So you see down here a plot that shows you the total pigeon abundance across the different circuit breaker phases. So the pre-circuit breaker is the darker shade of gray, medium shade is circuit breaker, and phase 2 is the lighter shade, right? And then 4 major food source types. So your hawker centers, your green spaces, your bin centers, as well as feeding hotspots. So here you would see the most significant drop in proportions of feral pigeons occurred actually at the hawker centers. You'd see the same also for feeding hotspots. It's also dropping across the phases as well. Right. So in terms of the activity budget surveys, we find that a greater proportion of feral pigeons were found foraging and moving during the circuit breaker phase, right? And correspondingly, you also get less pigeons that were resting. So this means because they're spending more time searching, moving around, searching for food, less time relaxing, right? There's less energy devoted towards reproduction. So the consequence of this is that it will likely lower their reproductive capacity, and that translates to slowing their population growth. Right, the next question we ask is, what are some of the factors that affect natural food foraging? So if they're not foraging on natural food sources like grass and so on, then they're foraging more so on human provided food, right? So here we're just looking on this particular graph, right? The proportion of pigeons in a flock that are foraging on natural sources of food. And here we find that there's a slightly greater proportion of pigeons that forage on natural food sources during the circuit breaker. However, a lesser proportion of pigeons forage on natural food post-circuit breaker. It seems a bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it, during a period of time, post-circuit breaker in phase 2, what happened was there was less people that were going down to the green spaces or the grass patches to manage them. And if you see in the picture at the bottom, what's happened is, the grass has been allowed to grow taller, right? It's become shrub-like. And what happens is the pigeons won't be foraging in these sorts of environments. They won't be diving into these shrubs to forage, right? They prefer open spaces to forage. So therefore, we didn't observe too many of them foraging on the grass patches. The last thing in which we note was the flocks that were feeding on natural food sources were also smaller, right? So they're smaller flocks tell me to say that they would also cause less disamenities. Okay, so in terms of management implications from this study, we found that there's a decrease in food abundance, would reduce the local feral pigeon abundance. We find also that pigeons spend more time foraging, less time resting during the circuit breaker, and this will have consequences for their reproductive success. And we also find that larger flocks are associated with feeding more so on human-provided food. So all this points to the fact that food limitation is very vital to control the pigeon population. Right, so the next study in which we look at was the ecology of pest birds and hawker centers. So we all know hawker centers are a major food source for pest birds. They represent essentially an ecosystem for highly adaptable bird species like you see the pictures down there, your feral pigeon, your Javan myna, your house crows. To me, they're a little bit like a forest ecosystem. So they also have, abundant food and varying structures for roosting. So you see it on there in the picture of that forest, different forest stratas. You have your emergent layer, right? So in a hawker center, emergent layer could be like your rooftop. Your canopy layer is like all these elevated pipes and vents, okay, that are above the stalls, right? So your understory and your shrub layer in the hawker center, that's like your table and your chairs and your forest floor, right? It's the floor of the hawker center, right? So we did this study to try and better understand how pest birds utilize these urban ecosystems so that we can formulate better, right, more informed control measures for them. So what is their distribution like? So you can see in this map down here, the pigeons are more abundant in the central region. So feral pigeons are indicated by that pink circle. Whereas for Javan mynas, as indicated by the blue circles, they are more homogeneous in their spread, isn't it? You see them across all the different hawker centers in which we did our surveys. The house crows, on the other hand, occur in relatively smaller numbers and are a problem in some hawker centers only. The next question we asked here was, what time of the day are the pest birds most abundant? So initially when we did our surveys, we started from as early as 7:30 in the morning all the way to 6 p.m. in the evening. And we counted, all these birds in the hawker centers every 1.5 hours. So we find that the pest birds are most abundant actually during breakfast hour, all right, 7:30 to 8 o'clock, and just about after lunch hour from 1:30 to 3 o'clock. The reason why they're not abundant right at lunch hour is because there's a lot of people around. So the pest birds waited, right, for the crowd to disperse, and then they'll come in later on to forage on the food waste. Right, next question is, what environmental factors affect pest bird abundance? So down here, there are 3 in which we found are a bit more significant. So the first one is the openness of the food center. Second is the percent of HDB cover that's around the hawker center. And the last is the deterrence index. I'll come to that in a bit. So yes, the more open the food center, the more pest birds you get inside a hawker center, right? We also found that, yes, if you have a higher percent HDB estates around your hawker center, that also means that there's a higher likelihood, right, that you have more feral pigeons in the hawker center. And we think that's the case because in HDB estates, you have a bit more this higher density of people. You have more people that potentially can feed pigeons on there. So they also represent areas in which pigeons can nest as well, right? And the last one, deterrence index, this seems a bit confusing because, you know, you would think that if you have more deterrence in a hawker center, right, you would have less pigeons. It appears not to be the case. This is a positive relationship. So the higher, right, the deterrence, the more pigeons there are in the hawker center. So the deterrence we're talking about down here is mainly the spikes and the reflectors that are put on elevated structures in a hawker center. And the reason, if you think about it, why they put all these deterrence measures on there in the first place is to put in hawker centers where there are more of these pest birds, right? But the thing is, if the deterrence measures are not doing the job of deterring the birds, then they'll still be present. And we find that it seems to be the case now here. So in the earlier picture you saw, right, there were these spikes that were put on the pipes, but the pigeons still managed to perch on it, right? So they probably perch between the spikes. It's not really doing an effective job of keeping them away from the hawker centers. Okay, so we also tried to look at what was the change in the abundance and the species composition after the circuit breaker. So we did the surveys before circuit breaker, but we also did surveys during the circuit breaker as well as in the HA phase, right? So quite remarkably, you don't find any differences in the species composition before, during, and during the HA phase. It's still, right, the feral pigeons are still very much in high abundance across the phases, followed by your German mynas and then your house crows. But what's interesting is the total abundance after circuit breaker has dropped quite dramatically by about 70%. And we attribute that, of course, to less food waste in these areas. So in terms of management implications and just to summarize the results, we find that food waste limitation during circuit breaker and phase 2 HA reduced pest bird abundance and also caused pest birds to spend a bit more time searching for food. And like we explained earlier on, those would have consequences for their reproductive capacity, would slow it down. And then deterrence measures like spikes have limited effectiveness in trying to keep these pest birds away from hawker centers. But we find that if you reduce the area of entry into the hawker centers, it will actually help to keep the pest birds out. So all in all, how does our research help to manage pest bird populations? So our studies provide evidence-based management solutions, right? And we always advocate a multi-pronged approach, right? So the first thing in which we always say is to limit the amount of food that's available to these pest birds, right? It reduces the abundance and consequently also slows their reproduction down. The other thing in which we can also do, right, is we found that in the hawker center study, if you change the design of the habitat, you modify the habitat by altering the building. In this case, in hawker centers, if you limit the openness of the hawker centers, that can also deter birds from entering these areas also, right? Okay, so now I'll pass the time over to Magena, who will talk about responsible interactions with urban birds.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Malcolm, so much. Yeah, so very interesting studies that were done, and now I will talk more about how we can even go about having responsible interactions with these urban birds that we do see around us, especially since we are getting more urbanized. Yeah, so can I have the next slide, please? So firstly, we definitely, don't want to feed the wildlife, because this will bring about very negative impacts. So firstly, there's already also sufficient food in the natural environment for them. So in Singapore, we do have a healthy ecosystem of flora and fauna, and all these native plants that we have in our green spaces are actually sufficient and also a sustainable food source for our wildlife. Yeah, and also naturally, wildlife do have an instinctive foraging and hunting skills. So when we do feed the wildlife, it actually takes away this natural behavior that they have. And of course, that's not what we want to do. It will not be beneficial for them as well. Yeah, and of course, if we do feed the animals, it does bring about certain impacts. So I will talk more about the impact. Can I have the next slide? So firstly, we will definitely see, unsustainable population growth, which I believe some of us might have seen maybe downstairs at our void decks. We see the pigeons growing in such big numbers. Usually it is because there is some feeding that's involved. Yeah, and because when there's feeding, as shared by Malcolm earlier, they actually spend less time finding for food. So they actually spend more of their resources on reproduction, and that's why their population will grow in such unsustainable numbers. Yeah, and of course, you will also see about a change in wildlife behavior. So, if we start feeding the wildlife, eventually the wildlife will start to venture out of their natural homes and habitats and approach us for food, because that's the easier method to get food. So they will definitely want to have the most efficient way of getting food. So they will start to approach us for it. And eventually they might also learn to become aggressive towards humans. Yeah, and of course, this will lead to potential human-wildlife conflicts, which I believe some of us would definitely be aware of. Like, for example, even the monkeys, the macaques in Singapore, we know that, sometimes they can be quite, or rather assertive towards humans, and they do snatch food away from humans. And, that's actually a change of behavior that happened over time as well. And that's why we don't want to encourage this kind of behavior in animals as well. And so this is a negative impact. So of course, additionally, the food that we feed them, it might not be nutritious enough for them as well. Yeah, because certain food that we give them might not be good for their bodies as well, and some foods may even make them unwell or even more susceptible to certain diseases. So then how can we interact responsibly with urban birds? Can I have the next 2 slides? Yeah. So firstly, we can carry out urban bird watching. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we can watch the birds from a distance. So I believe that many of us are familiar, or maybe some of you guys here are also very active birders who go out to watch birds actively. Yeah, and of course, there are actually many guided tours that are organized by NParks as well as the various nature groups in Singapore. Yeah, so some of the examples, can I have the next slide? So some of the examples would be the garden bird watch and the heron watch that we have. And parks do organize these activities. However, due to the COVID regulations, these activities have been put to a stop for some time. And definitely we do hope to open up these activities again once, as we currently are looking into opening up again. Yeah, and we definitely hope that we can start to host these activities again. Yeah. So of course, another way to interact responsibly with wildlife, would be to help the birds to reduce certain things that will even cause them to get injured. So for example, window strikes per se, because we live in such an urbanized area, there are so many glass buildings all around. And actually there are quite a number of window strikes that happen each year. Yeah, and because birds actually cannot really tell the difference between reflections and real vegetation. So sometimes when they see the reflection of the greenery that's in the glass, they actually fly right into it thinking that it is greenery, but it is actually not. And so unfortunately, they crash, and sometimes the crashes can be so bad that they instantly pass on from that crash itself. Yeah, and of course, in some cases, a territorial bird can also see its own reflection as a rival and then proceed to launch repeated attacks on the window pane. So from a study that was done in 2015, it was observed that bird window strikes was estimated at about 6 birds a month. So if we do look at this number per month, it looks like a small number, but if you look at it long term per se, if we look at it 1 year, that's actually quite a number of birds that we are looking at. Yeah, so if you can see the picture on the right, that's actually a very beautiful jumbo fruit dove that actually crashed into the school computer laboratory at, I think, Commonwealth Secondary School, if I'm not wrong. And this incident actually went viral because the bird actually passed away on the spot. Yeah. So what are some of the ways that we can even do to prevent window strikes? Can next slide, please? So one of the ways would be to stick non-reflective stickers. Yeah, so if you can see in this picture below, the before and after actually is quite a huge difference, right? When the non-reflective stickers are put up, you can tell that it makes it a lot more obvious and more visible for the birds as well. They are able to, they will not be confused by the reflections as easily. Yeah, so this was actually put up at Commonwealth Secondary School, I believe, after the incident happened. Yeah, and I believe that this is one of the ways that we can help to reduce these window strikes as well. And of course, there are some other methods that we can do. For example, maybe you put out some shades, outside your window, or yeah, some stuff like that can also be helpful for the birds. Yeah, but of course, we can do all the preventive measures that we want, but there are so many ways that birds can get injured, right? So sometimes we do still come across birds that are injured, and I think that is also part of it, and it's natural. But what can we do if we do encounter an injured bird? So of course, if the bird is small enough, you can try to put the bird into a box. Yeah, and of course, then you can call the 24 hours NParks hotline at 1800 476 1600 for further assistance. Yeah, so that'll be end of my sharing, and now I'll pass the time on to Dr. Xie Shangzhe, who will share more about the wild bird rehabilitation at Jurong Bird Park. And we do work closely with the Jurong Bird Park as well to rehabilitate these animals. So thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So yeah, like Magena mentioned, we work very closely with NParks and also acres to treat some of the wild birds that are brought into us. So we do not go out and rescue them, but if NParks and acres decide that they need further veterinary attention or treatment, then that's when we get involved. So today we talk about 3 white-bellied sea eagles that happened to come in at the same time some time ago to the Jurong Bird Park Avian Hospital. We usually get one of these species maybe every 6 to 12 months. So to have 3 of them come in at the same time was quite a unique situation. They were all unrelated from at different places, so there wasn't a pattern to their presentation. But I thought this story would showcase the full range of interventions and outcomes that were needed for them. So yeah, I promise there are 3 white-bellied seagulls in the picture. If you have trouble spotting them, I'll point out the other 2 later. But we'll talk about white-bellied seagull 1, which is the one in the red circle up on top of the high perch right now. So that one came in with the usual presentation of not being able to fly. I mean, if they could fly, there was no way that you would have been able to catch them and bring it in. So that's a very common presentation. And the bird was brought into our hospital, and we just kept it in one of our usual raptor rehabilitation cages. As you can see, it's designed specifically with 3 solid walls, and that's what they need to be in a safe space. It also received the usual diagnostic tests of a blood test and x-rays. And I don't expect you to see everything that we can see on the x-ray, but there was a very obvious injury on this x-ray. And you could probably have seen the asymmetry on that part of the x-ray, but more specifically where the red circle is, there was a fracture of a bone known as the coracoid bone for this patient. So the coracoid is part of the shoulder girdle in birds. So similar to humans, the shoulder is quite a complex structure in birds because of the range of motion needed for the wing. So if you start rotating your shoulder now, you should be able to go about 270 degrees. And a bird needs that as well so that they can do the flapping of the wings and change of direction while they are flying. And the coracoid is a very commonly fractured part of the shoulder because of the way the forces are transmitted when you knock your wing during flight. But we now know through several publications around the world that such fractures don't require surgery. So all they need usually is 2 or 3 weeks of rest. And one thing we didn't know, because all these publications involve birds that were smaller, the white-bellied sea eagle is much larger. So we weren't really sure if that applied to them too. But fortunately for this patient, we learned that that was the case as well. So as you can see, after 2 to 3 weeks of rest, that was white-bellied sea eagle 1 flying off to freedom back in the wild. And you can see here, no problems flying that long distance across the river or lake in this place. All right, and I mentioned there were 3 in this picture. So there was another one that was quite obvious up on the top perch beside white-bellied sea eagle 1. But there was also white-bellied sea eagle 3 down at the bottom. Now you can see it with that red circle. And he somehow managed to knock over the lower perch because he had some trouble flying. So for white-bellied sea eagle 2, unfortunately for this bird, we tried a variety of treatments and we eventually decided that it was never going to have the stamina required to survive in the wild. So it could fly relatively well in this small area, but it will get tired very easily and it will start panting after about 2 rounds of flying. So eventually we decided the best thing for it was to euthanize it, which was unfortunate for him. But for white-bellied sea eagle 3, that turned out to be a blessing in disguise because for that patient, you can see in the top left picture, his main problem was that he had broken primary flight feathers. So you can see there are holes between the feathers because they were damaged. And when you have such holes, you're not able to create the uplift needed for flight, even if you can flap your wings very well. So in this patient, using the feathers we collected from white-bellied sea eagle 2, we were able to do a procedure known as feather imping. So that's short for feather implantation, which sounds really fancy, but basically we're connecting feathers from a donor bird to the recipient bird using satay sticks in between them and lots of glue. So you can see in the top right picture, that's Dr. Allen, one of our vets, performing the procedure. So this was before COVID. Don't report her for not wearing a mask, please. And at the bottom left picture, you can see how perfect those feathers and wings look after the procedure. And the bottom right corner, that's how the wings look in flight. So for this patient, after receiving the new feathers, it went to another aviary, this time a smaller one because it's the only one we had left to rehabilitate. And after about a week, that was him flying straight out into the wild. Wait for it. Coming. And he realizes the door is open. Okay. All right, so yeah, you can see we had 3 birds, 3 different outcomes, but all in all, being able to rehabilitate 2 out of the 3 was quite a good outcome overall. Thank you.
All right, thank you speakers for sharing about the birds we can see in Singapore and how we can work towards human-wildlife coexistence in our city and nature. And now it's going to be time for our Q&A session. Thank you to everyone in the audience who submitted questions. We will now try to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. All right. The first one that we have here today is, what is the lifespan of pest birds like mynas as well as feral pigeons? So for this question, Malcolm will be taking it.
Yeah, so for mynas, I think in literature it's been recorded to be between 4 to 12 years. And for pigeons, roughly around 6 to 15 years. Of course, if the birds are kept in captivity, they would live for longer, right? So that's about the lifespan for them.
Thank you, Malcolm. All right, so for the next question, I think you might have covered this during your presentation, but I think somebody is asking, why are feral pigeons or rock pigeons in this sense considered pest birds?
Yeah, so for the pigeons on here, just to clarify, we're talking about the rock doves and the hybrids as such. So collectively, the feral pigeons, right? We consider them as pest birds because, as we mentioned earlier on, it's because they cause quite a lot of disamenities, from the soiling, right? And then also possibly damaging property, okay? And also they could potentially have some ecological impacts, it could be competing with some of our native pigeons as well, like your spotted doves or your zebra doves, right? So that's why we consider them as pest birds.
All right, thank you, Malcolm. Okay, so for the next question, someone is asking, how are pigeons being managed in Singapore? So for this particular question, I think we will ask Magena, would you be able to take this question?
Yeah. Hi. Okay. So there are definitely many methods that pigeons are managed. So we take a science-based approach towards the management of pigeons. And I think, as Malcolm has shared a little bit earlier as well, that this requires an integrated multi-pronged approach where we remove food sources made available by humans, as well as habitat modification and population control strategies such as culling, as well as research studies such as the one done by Malcolm to understand the population ecology of these pest birds, such as their roosting patterns and their movements. So just to bring back a little bit a recap of what Malcolm shared earlier. So the study conducted by NParks actually showed that 70% of the food that were consumed by pigeons were from anthropogenic sources. So anthropogenic meaning that it is provided by humans. So besides showing that the pest bird abundance can decline with an island-wide reduction in human-provided food, the study also demonstrated how their activity budgets have changed. So for instance, after the circuit breaker was implemented, the pigeons were observed to devote more time to searching for food and less time resting. So this would also reduce their reproductive capacity. So they will increase in their population at a slower rate. So this study actually supports that reducing their food is a sustainable approach to control the pigeon population in Singapore. So the study also supports the importance of proper waste management, as well as public education against feeding and littering, as well as enforcement actions against these things that are done by people. Yeah, and of course, we do work with various agencies to reduce food sources for pigeons, because there are many ways that people try to feed pigeons, and some of the ways include high-rise littering, as well as management of food waste at food establishments that are owned by the various agencies. So we have also pushed out an anti-feeding campaign that emphasizes that everyone has a part to play. And of course, for public such as you and I, we can help to mitigate the population growth and conservation issues by, like what I mentioned earlier, not feed the birds. And of course, when we dine in at hawker centers, what we can do is to make sure that we dispose of, our leftover food responsibly and properly as well. And just to share that anybody caught feeding pigeons can actually be fined up to quite a hefty fine of $10,000 under the Wildlife Act. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Magena, for sharing the multi-pronged science-based approach that NParks takes towards the management of pigeons. Okay, that was quite clear. Okay, so for the next question, what are the impacts on native bird populations if the population numbers of non-native birds increase? So for this question, we'll ask Hui Zhen.
Thanks for the question. So there are a few impacts that could happen. So the first is that there'll be competition between species that are closely related, competition for food and habitat. So for example, like the introduced red-whiskered bulbul is introduced species, they might compete with our native bulbuls, and then there'll be the introduced like wax bills as well. They will compete with our local mynas. So besides that, because species, when they forage closely together, right, there might be possible disease transmission as well. And then besides that, and if the habitat that they are found are, I mean, if species that are similar to each other are found in the same habitats, hybridization between the two species may occur. So for example, it's like the red jungle fowls interbreeding with the domestic species. And then last is that there could also be predation. So for example, the house crow raiding our native birds' nests. Yeah, so these are just some of the impacts that will happen on the native birds if the non-native birds numbers increase. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zhen. Yeah, so those are some of the effects or impacts that might happen. Okay. For the next question, someone was asking, what should we do if we come across an injured or ill raptor? So for this question, we'll be asking Dr. Shangzhe to answer this.
Yes, so you shouldn't try to handle an injured or ill raptor. The best thing to do is to call the NParks or ACRES hotline and wait for them to arrive if possible, and just keep an eye on the raptor until they arrive. A lot of these raptors, they like to play dead. So even for us, when they come into hospital, the first 24 hours, sometimes it's hard for us to tell if they are paralyzed or they're just too stressed to move. And if they want to, they could very suddenly grab you with their sharp talons and cause quite a bit of damage. So the best thing to do is to call NParks or ACRES and follow their instructions.
Great, thank you, Shangzhe. Yes, we definitely would want to call the professionals to come in to help if you do come across an injured or ill raptor. Now, what should we do if we then come across a baby bird on the ground? Shangzhe, for you as well.
Yep. So again, still the best thing to do is to call NParks or ACRES, but this time their questions and instructions might be quite different, because the best outcome for a baby bird found on the ground is usually if they are reunited with their parents. So while you're calling, look around, see if there's a nest nearby, see if you notice that their parents are nearby. A lot of times the baby birds are just learning to fly in a stage where they're called the fledgling. So if they're not able to fly well, they might not necessarily be injured. And if their parents are around, usually they would be trying to help them. But sometimes the parents have gone out of the nest for a little bit, so they might still come back. So once you call NParks or ACRES, usually they will ask the same set of questions. And if you find a nest or if the parents are nearby, then someone from NParks or ACRES might come down to help with the reuniting of the parents and chick.
Yeah. Great. I think that's very clear, Shangzhe, for sharing with us. It helps, I think, a lot of the public to know what to do if they come across baby birds on the ground. Yeah. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. Okay, so I think this will be the last question. What steps are taken to conserve the biodiversity of native birds in Singapore? So I guess for this question, we will have Dr. Malcolm Soh answer this for us.
Yeah, so I think for this one, what we're trying to do right now through our city and nature vision is to enhance the habitat. So this will include actually planting, like native trees that provide food as well as homes for these birds. The other thing in which we're trying to do also is to increase the connectivity between forest patches, via this extensive network of green park connectors, right? Other things in which we do also are constant monitoring across, different years. We do this census, right? And we talked about the Garden Bird Watch, and that's conducted by us, as well as with partners like the NSS Bird Group. Another thing in which we do also is to try and do, like we introduced to you just now, quite a bit of research, right? To better understand the ecology as well as the distribution of these native birds. And the last thing which we do is also some community outreach and engagement to raise the awareness of native bird species, and also to educate and highlight the importance of protecting and conserving them. Yeah.
Great. All right, so with that, I think I would like to thank everybody in the audience who submitted questions. I hope we have answered the most that we can. And I would also like to thank all the speakers again for their very generous sharing. Thank you for joining us on Zoom as well as on YouTube today, and have a great day ahead. See you.